Gonna go ahead and get started. So hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. This is our third installment in the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Groups series on integrative pest management practices for rights of way. And today's webinar is going to be focused on management for invasive annual grass species. So our two featured speakers, Dr. Brian Mueller and Dr. Shannon Clark, will discuss strategies on how to effectively manage invasive annual grass species, including how and why management might differ by region. They will also be sharing some case studies from their work with this species, including partnership approaches they have found to be effective. And we will have about 15 minutes at the end for audience questions and discussion. So please submit any questions that you might have during the presentation into the chat, and we will address those at that time. Our hosts for today's webinar are Dr. Ashley Bennett from the Electric Power Research Institute, it's Toby Chu from Southern Power Company, Caroline Hernandez from the University of Illinois Chicago, and myself, Allison Little, also from the University of Illinois Chicago. So Ashley's going to be facilitating our audience Q&A session later on, and Caroline is going to be helping to manage our webinar today. So if anyone is having any technical difficulties, please feel free to shoot her a direct message in the chat and she'll be able to help you out. I'm going to give it over to Toby now, who's going to cover some housekeeping items.
Yes, thank you, Allison. So yes, please make sure that you're muted and that you keep your video off. If you'd like to update your displayed name to include your organization, you can go to the settings and then go to the general settings and then under session identity. If you would like, you can enter your full name and organizations. Like Allison said, if you have technical issues, any difficulties, please contact Caroline in the chat and then submit any other questions or comments in the Q&A box. So we are recording this presentation and we'll share it afterwards. And then again, we're going to share the names and emails of the webinar attendees to help people connect. And then if you'd like to be excluded from that list, please let us know. You can go to the next slide. Oh, thank you. All right, so let me talk a little bit and introduce you to today's presenters. So Dr. Brian Mueller is the director of University of Wyoming's Research and Extension Center in Sheridan, and he's also the director of the Institute for Managing Annual Grasses Invading Natural Ecosystems, or IMAGINE, which is a great acronym. He's also the professor in the Department of Plant Sciences. So in his research, teaching, and outreach programs, focuses on restoring rangeland ecosystems that are negatively impacted by invasive plants. He and his wife Rachel enjoy being outdoors with their 4 sons, Bracken, Grady, Sawyer, and Weston. And then Dr. Shannon Clark, she is the Development and Technical Services Manager in the Range and Pasture and Vegetation Management for InView. She covers the Upper Plains region. She received her PhD in weed science from Colorado State University in 2019, and she's continued there as a postdoc researcher before starting with the environmental science group at Bayer Crop Science, that then morphed into InView. Shannon continues to collaborate with Colorado State University as a faculty affiliate and serves on the boards of several organizations focusing on invasive plant species, including the Western Society for Weed Management and the Colorado Weed Management Association. So thank you for both of them for coming and presenting. And without further ado, I'll let them present.
Hello, everybody. Shannon, did we want to fill in any more on introduction stuff or just kind of go into the slides?
I think that was good for me if you want to just get started.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about this opportunity. Shannon and I have been able to collaborate not only on research but on a number of workshops and seminars through the years was trying to think of how many different states we have ended up presenting in at the same time at different things, and it's quite a few in the Western U.S. We're going to talk about a relatively unique topic when it comes to invasive plant management today, invasive annual grasses in the Western U.S. And I say unique, not because of sort of a limited spatial scope, but I think because of the challenges that it presents, both from an ecological standpoint in terms of control and impacts, but also just really because of the scale of the problem. When we think about invasive plant species in terms of functional groups in the Western U.S., annual grasses probably exceed all others when it comes to acreage infested and the impacts. And we're going to touch on that a little bit as we go through. Shannon and I, we think we've gotten the details figured out to work through the slide set, but bear with us as we kind of work through today and give you, I would say, a pretty brief survey of this issue, and hopefully we'll have enough time at the end to answer some of your questions in a little bit more detail. We work primarily in Western rangeland ecosystems, or at least I do. Shannon's got a little bit more of a diverse portfolio of systems that she works in. This is a picture in northeastern Wyoming, and not unusual, rangelands comprise the majority of the landscape in the Western U.S. As an ecosystem, they function at very large scales, interconnected systems that not only do wildlife depend on, but communities, livestock producers, and others. And invasive annual grasses can have significant impacts and changes to the rangeland ecosystems that you see here. I'd also like to point out that this beautiful, diverse rangeland that we're looking at here was actually dominated by invasive annual grasses about 2 years prior to this photo being taken. This happens to be one of our pastures in Wyoming. There is a multi-stage process to invasive annual grass problems on Western rangelands, and I think a lot of the press, a lot of the sort of common publications and information that people hear is this relationship between, let's just say, between cheatgrass and fire. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more, but I said it's a multi-stage process. Increasing evidence will suggest that invasive annual grasses readily move into systems in the absence of fire. We'll look at some data as well, and that they have significant impacts just with the invasion process. And those impacts really look in a number of different ways, such as reduced species diversity, reduced forage quality for both wildlife and livestock, a number of different other instances that aren't just plant related. In many cases, we see direct and indirect impacts to wildlife and things like erosion and nutrient cycling. And really, that all occurs in the absence of fire. But one of the key things that's been published widely about annual grasses in Western rangelands is that they're almost tool users, in that they benefit from fire disproportionately compared to many of our native plants. And so, as you can see in this upper picture, the purple and tan is cheatgrass, downy brome. It's a non-native invasive annual grass that dries out and senesces earlier in the season, and it produces a highly flammable fine fuel that ignites easily, and it carries a fire easily. And the lower right is actually a picture that was just taken last week from a wildfire in Johnson County, Wyoming, that we don't absolutely know yet, but I think was related to cheatgrass issues in that part of the state. Some of the pretty obvious impacts that we see in this interaction between invasive annual grasses and fire is direct loss of agricultural productivity in terms of a grazing resource, but also, I mean, a number of producers every year see direct losses to some of their livestock when we have these large, rapidly moving wildfires and terrible sites such as wildlife that are unable to move out of the way of this very expansive wildfire that you can see in the background. These are very obvious, very sort of evident direct impacts related to invasive annual grasses. And one of the key issues that we know about these situations is that if we can be a little bit more proactive and try to manage not only the ignition sources, but also reduce the abundance of invasive annual grasses prior to fire events like this happening, that we may be able to reduce the likelihood of these catastrophic fires across the western U.S. I talked a little bit earlier about this transition and this dominance by invasive annual grasses. Some recent very wide scale research in the Great Basin of the western U.S. actually suggests that this expansion in invasive annual grass dominance is occurring rapidly over the past 20 years, 25 years, and that the expansion on unburned acres has happened even greater than on places where we have seen wildfires. And that's particularly important when we think about the sagebrush grassland ecosystems of the western U.S. Some work out of the University of Nebraska suggests that the sagebrush grassland biome, in particular parts of Wyoming and immediately surrounding states, is one of the most intact grassland ecosystems in the world that remains currently. And in spite of that intactness, we are losing roughly 1.3 million acres of sagebrush grassland ecosystems to some kind of degradation annually. When I say some kind of degradation, roughly 70% of that loss is directly attributed to invasive annual grasses, their direct impacts, and their associated impacts with fire. We think about big sagebrush species specifically. They do not respond well to fire. They don't resprout. And so when we have these areas that burn much more frequently, when we have a high load of invasive annual grasses, it's nearly impossible to reestablish sagebrush into those systems once they have converted to dominance by annual grasses. And this is a major conservation concern, and it's at such a large scale that really no single entity can make a difference. It requires a number of partnerships across land ownerships and across jurisdictions, and we're going to hopefully touch on that a little bit as we move throughout the presentation today. Most of the problematic invasive annual grasses that we have they're not native to the United States. They're typically winter annuals, which means that if we get sufficient moisture, they germinate in the fall. They are able to rapidly grow at cool temperatures and really use up resources before many of our more desirable perennial plants are able to actively grow. And so they preemptively deplete those resources from the soil. They dry out quickly, much more quickly than our native perennials, and increase fire risk throughout the year. And it's all about seed production. As annuals, it's a numbers game. Their entire strategy is live fast, reproduce, and die. And so we're going to talk about the impacts and sort of the opportunities that trying to manage those seeds in the ecosystem gives to us. And I'll say some of the challenges that comes along with that as well. A lot of our discussion has talked about this contrast between being proactive versus being reactive. This is a photo of some sagebrush transplants that are being protected from herbivory in central Idaho. And you can see there's a matrix of invasive annual grasses, primarily cheatgrass, in between these sagebrush plants. We can talk about the importance of sagebrush to these ecosystems a little bit as we go on today. But the key is that really once we have lost it, it's really difficult to get it back. And I would say it's darn near impossible at worst. And at best, it's really difficult and really expensive. they really changed the nature of these ecosystems. This is a beautiful photo from Joshua Tree National Park. And historically, all of that tan sort of colored grass in between those shrubs and the Joshua trees would not have occurred there. This is another annual brome, red brome. And this is not a fire adapted ecosystem. And you get these flashy continuous fuels that is able to carry a fire through that ecosystem. And we have a really unique species that is not adapted to fire. And the rules have kind of changed because of these annual grasses and their association with this disturbance that is fire. And again, as much the same way as with big sagebrush, once we lose Joshua trees in these settings, very difficult, and we may not really know how to recover those. And so taking action before we reach this stage is probably the highest leverage strategy we can use when it comes to annual grass management.
Yeah, thanks, Brian, for the great introduction. This is going to be probably the most text-heavy slide, so I apologize, but I thought it was really good to include because a couple of years ago, so now we kind of had an introduction to those annual grasses, and I wanted to pull it back in directly to the impacts to right-of-ways, and in terms of being, if most of you working in that right-of-way space, managing land within those corridors. A couple of years ago, I did a big review of right-of-way, annual grass, and the impacts between those two. And there actually hasn't been that much research directly in that space. In fact, there's very little. But what we know in rangeland really translates into the right-of-way space because so many of our right-of-ways are crossing rangeland type habitats. So it is all interrelated, and our learnings from rangeland can really be applied to the right-of-way space. But looking just at right-of-ways, most of our wildfires actually occur within half a mile of a road or some sort of place where we're passing through primarily with vehicles. So a lot of those starts are coming off of roads. But where we do have power infrastructures going through, there are fewer wildfires being ignited, off of roads, out where power infrastructure is running through. But when they do ignite, they're often larger and more catastrophic than those ones that are started closer to a road where we can catch them. And I think of the Camp Fire when I think of this. In California, it was the most devastating, most deadly fire in California history, and it was started because of a failure with power infrastructure. Now, not all annual grass related, because there was other vegetation, we of course have trees and brush and things that can promote fire in these settings, but annual grass can really help move these fires when they are started. Wildfires in the Western US, just as a whole of the Western US, not just talking about right-of-ways, are larger and more destructive. These are also the states that are dominated by annual grasses. So we can really see, through research, it's shown annual grasses promote wildfire. We know that annual grasses are predominantly in the Western states. So they promote that fire frequency and spread, but right-of-ways are also a conduit for annual grass spread, even with the absence of wildfire. And so, as Brian talked about, annual grasses spread even without fire into areas, and right-of-ways are a disturbance across the landscape. And so that is a conduit for their spread. And these annual grasses, when they get started, do start to degrade critical wildlife and pollinator habitat, and then also, of course, promote fire. So just a quick jump into annual grass ID. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I really encourage you to go to the invasivegrasses.com. So this is Brian's group. He put it together, and I stole some of his resources for the slide set, but they've put some really great resources out that you can go to their website and use. And so this ID sheet is one of those, looking at the main annual grass players. And so what I would add to the top part in terms of Western US grasses is red brome, which Brian did mention with the Joshua trees, but it really falls into that category of cheatgrass and Japanese brome, the two species at the top of this sheet. They're all bromous species, so they're similar in nature, and in terms of management, going to be very similar in the way we think about managing them. So we can kind of lump those together, but the brome species, and especially cheatgrass, is the most widespread. Sometimes you'll hear it called downy brome as well. These are going to be hairy seedlings, so that's where you get the brome name from. And so when you're IDing in the field, that's one of the key ways you can ID a broma species when you start to learn how to ID these. Where your Medusa head and Ventinata species, which are also I would say the top, in the top annual grasses that we have in the Western US, they're going to have less hair. So Ventinata is essentially hairless, Medusa head, just a few fine hairs. But I'd encourage you to study this sheet. I won't go through all the how to ID them just because of the amount of time we have today, and it's really hard to do that on a webinar. But some of I would just call it like Ventinata has this bend in its on there, and that's a good defining characteristic for Ventinata. In the field, they can look very similar and be easily mistaken for each other, or you just look out and go, oh, I have cheatgrass, when it can really be another annual grass. Bulbous bluegrass, I would say, it's on there and it is an issue we have, but it's kind of a unique one, and where it's not it's not the same as the other ones in that it produces these bulblets. It's the only grass species, I believe, in North America that does that, but it's also invasive in some of these sites. So like we've talked about, cheatgrass is the most widespread annual grass we deal with. 50 to 70 million acres might even be an old estimate. I think that's been used for the last decade now and probably needs to be upped, but definitely covers a lot of acres in the Western US is the main threat, up until this point, I would say. But I want to spend some time on these two species. And, Brian's very familiar with these because of some things that have happened in the last decade up in his area in northern Wyoming. But Ventinata and Medusa head have existed in the US for quite a while. Ventinata, I think, since the mid-1900s, Medusa head even longer, but they kind of stayed in that Pacific Northwest or down through California region for a long time. And then in 2015 or 16, they found both of these species in the same year in Sheridan County, Wyoming. Come to find out, they had actually been discovered and put into their herbarium records a couple decades earlier, but nothing was ever done or said about them. But in 2015-16, they started to notice them on the landscape and started to track their spread. And from that time to now, almost 10 years later, especially Ventinata has blown up in the Great Plains ecoregion. And I think before that, a lot of researchers even thought, well, I don't think, these species are quite adapted to spread into these ecoregions. And when they got here, Ventinata has spread faster than anything I've ever seen spread. I think Brian would say the same thing. They thought they were going to be able to manage them in this area, and then as they started looking out, they found them more and more. And every year, just the amount of spread, and you would treat for them, and you'd go back the next year, and everything around where you hadn't treated, where you had treated, everything around it would be infested now. And so these are ones that have just been on the radar now for the last almost decade to watch out for, and people have really been putting a lot of management efforts focused around these. Why? Because a lot, at the beginning it was like, well, they're just replacing cheatgrass. We have cheatgrass in these ecosystems. Does it really matter if we have another annual grass? And the reason being is because they're so much worse than cheatgrass. They provide basically no livestock or wildlife forage value. They have high silica content, so animals don't graze them like they would graze cheatgrass earlier on in the season. They're invading at an extremely fast rate of spread compared to cheatgrass, where yes, it spreads, but it hasn't spread in this amount, like we were seeing these species spread in this new ecoregion. And then they have that same thing as cheatgrass, where they produce large amounts of fine fuel litter. So these have really been the focus, and I encourage you to just get to know the ID on these species. And if you're working in Western regions, to look at management of these species in particular. So I just wanted to throw this in to kind of set up, planning sites or management. We're going to go into tools next. Brian's going to start us into that, or I guess maybe I'm going to, I can't remember. But this is prioritizing kind of where we're going to treat. And so I just wanted to start showing this picture because it is really critical to think about these things up front before you start planning treatments. And it's what sites are you going to target? And you really want to target those sites that first that you can still save. And those would be ones, and we'll get more into this as we show a lot of pictures coming up. But those are going to be sites that have existing perennial plant populations so that when we manage the annual grasses, there's something there to respond. And we don't want to go into your worst sites first. You don't want to go into your sites that are going to need reseeding or revegetation first. These are the sites you want to treat where they treated, you can see the before, there's a lot of cheatgrass intermixed in the site, the sagebrush site. They treated 3 years after treatment. They've really restored this area well, and you see the sagebrush and perennial grasses healthy in that site now. And so one topic I wanted to bring up for planning purposes was this idea of remote sensing. So I won't spend a ton of time on this, but just the fact that remote sensing has been being used on right of way, especially in recent years as improved technology and costs of satellite imagery have decreased. It's made it a lot more financially doable to use remote sensing to do utility treatment planning or utility planning in general. And so a lot of models already exist for things like tree height or looking at encroachment, strike threats to power lines. But what about this idea of invasive annual grasses? So I want to just touch quickly on that we do actually have remote sensing tools available for annual grasses. They've been used a lot in the sense of rangeland sites. But again, we can apply the same concept to utilities. And so there's several free tools you can use for landscape-wide planning. So when you're looking at planning your treatments, if you have a whole state or county or region you're looking at, you can use something like the rangeland analysis platform. It's really fun to go on there and you just go in and you can look at any area of the country. It will show, it groups annual grasses together. So you're not going to get species specific models, but you can look at annual grasses and see an area maybe that has a higher rate of those. This is at like a 30-meter resolution imagery that you're looking at. So it's going to be more of a broader scale that you can use that to look at. EdMaps is great for just looking at invasive species that have been reported by land managers. These are all reports that are made by somebody that has found an incident of an invasive species on the ground, reported it into this system. Those are really great to start your planning. And then you can move into more project regional, finer scale tools. So something like we have a product called Range View, which you can go in and draw, a polygon in, and then it sends you satellite imagery at a 3-meter resolution scale back. This is a paid platform that you pay on a per acre basis. And then Brian's group, Imagine, also does a finer scale imagery thing, and that's kind of on a project by project basis. And I think it's mostly been in Wyoming, but it's also another option for this finer scale imagery. So I just wanted to quickly run through how you can use that, this imagery to plan a treatment. And then after this, we'll get into actually what you can use to treat. But if say you have a situation like a series of power lines that run through a large area of the Western US and you're concerned about the fire risk with invasive annual grasses. So you can capitalize during your off season of planning treatments by pulling imagery from the previous year. And so you start with something like EdMaps to see maybe what species might be there, like is there Medusa head that has been detected in this area? If you don't know that already, you go on to the rangeland analysis platform and see, okay, what are my areas that have maybe the densest infestations? And then you start to prioritize. And so maybe you use a tool like Range View to scan your power line corridors in a certain area. Maybe it's a county or even just a certain section of a county. You get the imagery back. It would highlight in red where your species, and this is species specific model, so it would tell you Medusa head or ventinata or cheatgrass. It's going to highlight it in red for you. And then you can start to prioritize your treatments for the next year and say, okay, I think I want to go in to this area over here where there's a lot of red along this corridor, and we're going to focus our treatment efforts this year. So just an idea for how you can use some of these digital tools to plan treatments. Oops. I skipped, and now it's back to Brian for a second. You can hit it back.
I think we're both clicking buttons for the slides at the same time. Sorry, Shannon.
Okay.
Yeah, so that prioritization piece is incredibly important when we're dealing with the number of acres that we're dealing with annual grasses. And Shannon did a great job talking about that and how important it is. If we're kind of waiting until we've lost all the good guys and our recovery potential on those sites is basically gone, and we're having to intentionally reseed or reestablish desirable plants, we're kind of, the train has left the station at that point. And so being more active when you have intact recovery potential on those sites is really important. That also makes it a little more challenging when we try to decide, how do we actively control annual grasses in a system that is largely dominated. Our non-target desirable species are also grasses. So we've got all these different tools, and whether we're talking about herbicides or grazing or burning, really are, and this is no different than other perspectives of different types of weeds, different functional groups. We have to make sure that our control activities are compatible with the species that we want to retain and enhance on those sites. And so that could look like selecting the appropriate herbicide and using it at the right time, or it could be using the right grazing approach at the right time of the year, but not so much that you begin to damage those desirable perennials. And so as researchers often do, a group of us took a look at, oh, there we go again. The delay is killing me here. What had been published specifically about cheatgrass control in all the scientific literature. And so we looked over roughly 64 years of literature, and really the take-home conclusion to this is that if we compared burning, grazing, herbicide, all these other things, if the boxes and bars are to the left of the 0 line, then that shows a reduction in cheatgrass, and the filled squares are short-term, and then the open squares are long-term, and then we have perennial grasses on the right that would show the opposite. If you look at that pattern with herbicides and revegetation, really herbicide was the only thing in the literature that consistently led to a reduction in the abundance of cheatgrass for both the short and long term. And it also led to an increase over the short and long term for perennial grasses, even more so than did herbicide combined with revegetation. And so we can talk about some of these other tools a little bit, but since the literature pretty clearly points out that given our current state of knowledge, that chemical control is probably the most effective means of control we have, we're gonna focus a lot of our comments on chemical control for this presentation, and we can address some of the others maybe in the question time.
Okay, I'm gonna boogie through these because I think we're running out of time here, but just kind of reiterating about these are annual plants, and so they really rely on seed production, and most of our native plants, especially our grasses that we're going to come across, are perennials, and so they do have a different life cycle. And when we talk about targeting them, we really want to focus on managing the soil seed bank. And so these plants are going to deposit seed into the soil seed bank every year, and then they withdraw it in the form of germination, either the following year, or that seed can remain viable in the soil for up to so many years. And so, which leads us into the next slide showing how long does it stay viable in the seed bank. Well, it's hard to give an exact answer because this is going to be site specific and environmental specific, but estimates throughout literature have shown it's probably less than 5 years. And so this was just a study that utilized glyphosate to prevent the seed from going, or from the cheatgrass from seeding out. every year from 0 to 5 years. And they really found that with 4 or 5 years of management of preventing seed from going into the seed bank, they had reduced, you stop seeing seed come back in, or your new cheatgrass plants come back in. So kind of got this estimate of if we can manage for that 3 to 5 year period, we can probably deplete the seed bank of viable seed. And that's how we want to focus our management efforts. And so herbicide really gives us the best option to do that. It can be combined with other tools as well, but really what's been successful is herbicide to prevent that, or to help deplete that seed bank. I'm just going to highlight 2 of them, and then there's another slide we have that kind of shows a few more options, but really there's the 2 main ones that have been used or that are being currently used today. So the first is a Mazapic. This is going to be it's very effective, but it's more shorter term. So give 1 to maybe 2 years of really good control, but then that seed usually comes back in from the seed bank because it does break down in the soil quicker. It does give pre-emergent and post-emergent activity. So I put this little chart on the bottom, and maybe we can share our slides with you so you can refer back to this if you have questions or using it for management. But you can use it at before it germinates all the way through that kind of 3-leaf stage in the later fall. And then we have Invasive, which is, well, kind of newer, but now it's been around for maybe almost 10 years in the range area, in the natural area space, and then in the rangeland space for about 4 years. But it has a longer soil residual. This is a pre-germination herbicide only, so it does need to go down before any of the seeds, the intergrass seeds, are germinating and get incorporated into the soil solution with moisture. We like to have about a 1/2 inch of moisture, or not we like, the herbicide does require about 1/2 inch of moisture to really get worked into the soil solution and provide control of those germinating seeds. So it does have that long soil residual. It's not a good option for sites that do need to be reseeding because you cannot seed directly into this for several years after application. And so, so those are some of the pros and cons, but a very successful tool in providing, working on that seed bank depletion because of the long residual. So this is just pulling some data from several studies that occurred over the Western US. Several different universities participated in them, looking at andrograss control through the 4th summer after treatment. This is just with 1 application of these herbicides. And so really showing that long residual with Invasive, holding about 90% control. And this is over several different andrograss species where we're seeing essentially no control with the Mazapic at that 4th summer. So this is where we're really showing that's how we can deplete that seed bank. We're getting to that 4th, 5th year mark on that seed bank, which we showed in the previous figure. That's when we can really expect there's not going to be a lot of viable seeds left in that seed bank. And then there is a lot going on in this figure, but I will just quickly break it down. And again, I think you can access this on the Imagine website. And so you can study it longer, but it's great as a land manager. You can kind of look at what season are you going to go out and treat. We'll also let you know what seasons are going to be the better options, but winter through fall, like what am I going to go out with? And so you can kind of see the herbicides listed over here. So if you're starting in summer and it's pre-germination, Invasive is a good option. And so you get that moisture to incorporate it. When you move into fall, you start getting closer to that germination, or you do get into the germination window. You either need to start going out with a Mazapic, or you can use these rimsulfuron, sulfosulfuron as a post-emergent or tool, or you can combine them with Invasive, which those combinations have ended up being kind of the best option for long-term control, is combining something like Invasive with a Mazapic for multi-year control. So you get that control post-emergent with the Mazapic that year you're going out treating, and then the Invasive provides that control going forward through several years. And then I think we're back to Brian.
Yeah, we've had a great fortune in some ways. I mean, it's not a good fortune because we're dealing with a bunch of annual grasses, but it's a good fortune in working with partnerships with a bunch of folks around the Western U.S. Shannon's been plugged into some of those as well. We just thought we'd go through some of these pictures. You can see in most of these that we're going to show kind of the yellowish tan vegetation. is where those annual grasses are dominant, as you can see in these areas outside of the treated area. And then the green, more vibrant vegetation is perennial, desirable rangeland vegetation that is recovered after being released from competition with those annual grasses from previous treatments. I'm kind of going to talk about partnerships as we go through these and just let these pictures speak for themselves, and that when we're working at scales such as this, even if we have a tremendously large land holding from an individual rancher, there are intersections of rights of ways and roads and other landowners and in holdings that when we're trying to work at a landscape scale and be proactive, that partnerships and understanding of the situation and sharing information and education with neighbors and landowners is incredibly important. This is one site where we had a field tour a few years ago. Campbell County Weed and Pest had felt like they had sprayed all of the existing Ventonata that they had found in this pasture. We came out a year after treatment, and you can see how much had actually been missed, and that's really not a fault of their own. That's what happens when we're dealing with a plant that spreads by seed very rapidly and sometimes moves with the wind. Striking control, excellent control where it was treated, and then you can see the parts of this photo that are shown up as non-treated were deemed to be non-invaded the prior year to this picture being taken. And that kind of illustrates that rapid spread that Shannon was talking about earlier. Great higher elevation site here. You can see the native plant recovery, and you can almost feel sort of the fire protection when you look at these pictures from the left to the right, and the less likelihood of ignition and an incredible release of some of the native plants in that site as well. This is a picture that we've shown a number of different times. The impacts of these treatments over multiple years, and we have worked with partners at this point around the state of Wyoming that have treated well over 300,000 acres for these annual grasses, very strategically in partnership with 30 plus partners, and are trying to take a very much a landscape scale approach to this. Here you can see a number of desirable forbs that were released in that adjacent to a non-treated area that's got a lot of Ventonata. You can see blue bunch wheatgrass and a number of desirable plants on the right.
Okay, I'm gonna quickly go through this because I know we're running up to our question time.
Yeah, we're way over, Shannon.
I know. We love to talk about annual grasses, so it's hard for us to calm down, but we just have so much we can share. But I wanted to show quickly this biodiversity evaluations that Boulder County has been conducting. And so they have several areas where they've done annual grass treatments, and they've run these belt type transects. And I thought this was a good example to show ways you could actually run some evaluations on your own utility lines, because the shape of the belt transects, similar to how you would have these long strips along a utility or a right-of-way corridor. And so what they do is they're monitoring 15 feet from either side of this treatment line, which annual grasses provide us this really nice, clear treatment line here to do that with. And so all they're doing is looking at species presence and absence. They've also done some kind of flower counts per plant, and then we've used some of these sites to do pollinator work as well. But I thought a good example, you can actually see this is on a roadside here. So a really good kind of right of way. You might, be able to use this to do some quick evaluations in your sites, just to monitor diversity. Oh, let's see if I can get this to go. Okay. So they've done this for the past 5 years or so. They did take data this year as well, but this was just to quickly show the non-treated, these dark bars here. The species richness has stayed about the same through the years. It's going to fluctuate a little bit with precipitation and whatnot. But in the treated sites, you can see we've just seen massive increases in species richness with the annual grasses removed from these sites. It's not going to be that case in every site. This is a really diverse ecosystem they're working in, but a good example of what grasses are actually doing to that ecosystem. They also have tracked rare species, and so these are some of their rare species deemed rare for the county, and seen the density of rare plants just explode over the course of 4 years from treatment. Then they also saw an increase in the number of flowers per plant. They monitored 34 species for that, and so which makes sense because the grasses are stealing moisture from in nutrients and things that the perennial plants use. And so one of the first things they're going to do is stop reproduction and stop flowering. And so you see the number of flower per plants reduced when you have that annual grass present. But when you release it from that annual grass, taking that moisture and such, it can put on more flowers, which can also translate into increased pollinator habitat. So we used several of these sites to do some pollinator sampling, and this was done in 2020, this study specifically. And that was a really dry year, so there actually stuff was really lagging, and flowering was a lot less than in other years because of the extreme drought that was in 2020. But what we did see, even with the drought, was that in treatments we had an increase, so basically a 2 times increase in the number of different species we observed on our transects that we ran for, we did all floral visitors, so not just pollinators. And then when we looked at just the number of pollinators we observed per transect, we saw increases in both pollinator groups and then other types of insects on the transects. And so we saw more insects and pollinators visiting those sites that had been treated for annual grasses, basically, than the sites that were not treated and that were still invaded by annual grasses. So basically providing better pollinator habitat. And I think Brian has a slide if I can get to forward.
Yeah, outstanding benefits to things like pollinators. We also were interested in both livestock and wildlife. I'm going to just kind of, there may be an animation on here, give you the take home for this. In places where we were able to successfully control annual grasses and shift that dominance back toward perennial grass and forbs, we had a higher amount of high quality forage that maintained its nutritional content later into the season than we did in places that were dominated by annual grasses. We basically replaced the biomass that was tied up in annual grasses back to perennial grasses within 1 year after treatment with indaziflam. And so that leads to an improved forage situation for livestock. And we've also been working for about 3 years on a really neat project with a whole bunch of partners with a bunch of GPS collared mule deer. And those mule deer are also responding to this change in forage quality throughout the season. And they are preferring some of those areas that have been treated to non-treated rangelands at different time of year. That's sort of the short story for that. We can touch on that a little bit more. Basically, won't spend a lot of time on this. Reiterate some of the proactive sort of decision-making processes that if we wait until we've lost our desirable perennials, we might have more options over here on the left in our toolbox because we've got sort of less of a balancing act that we need to do, but our likelihood of success of maintaining the desirable qualities of that ecosystem are much lower. And recognizing this fact is really kind of an analogy to healthcare, and that we should focus instead of focusing on those like highly problematic, highly impacted areas where we've got a really heavy lift to restore those sites. We should really focus on being proactive and defending what's in good quality and understanding that invasion moves across the landscape and trying to prevent those areas from becoming degraded and then expanding out into those transition zones with active management instead of just going to the worst places while the good places continue to be degraded and moved downward in a trend. And so Shannon has mentioned invasivegrasses.com several times. We talk a lot about a philosophy of defending your core, defining what those risks are to some of the high value places that provide the characteristics of an ecosystem that you want to manage for, and then developing a spatial strategy to defend that from not only the impacts of invasive annual grasses, but other weed species and other problems that may move in and lead to degradation on those sites. And it's really important, especially with this interaction for fire, that we deal with invasive annual grasses.
Yeah, and I'll just click through some pictures here as we get to the questions slide, so you guys can have an opportunity to ask some questions, but just showing the impacts treatments can have on reducing fire risk. And then just a few examples I threw in for planning treatments, specifically in terms of right-of-way or utility corridors, fire breaks on access roads, and roadside treatment programs. So yeah, just the key takeaway again, I think we've gone over this enough, is choosing your core area, planning your treatments out. And why are we doing this? So we can lessen the impact of the severity experienced during a fire, and then also protect that critical pollinator and wildlife habitat. Okay, sorry for the rush at the end, but we planned a lot of slides, I guess. So I guess now we can take any questions that might have come in.
Yeah, you guys, thank you so much for a really informative presentation. We do have a couple of questions that have come in to the Q&A. So the first question that came in is there a general source for these invasive annual grasses? Are people planting them? They don't seem to have much, ornamental value. So can you guys speak a little bit to the source of these invasive annual grasses?
Yeah, I can take a stab, Shannon, first. I mean, if we're talking about source of introduction into the U.S., there's a whole bunch of different hypotheses where they came from. I would say a likely source that has been pointed to in a number of different times is contamination of some type of crop seed, potentially wheat seed. Some folks think that cheatgrass may have been introduced with ballast of a sailing ship or of a sailing vessel a long time ago, or even packing material. So back before we had packing peanuts and styrofoam and the little poppy film things, people would pack dishes, 100 years ago in straw. And that when we had some immigration from parts of Central Europe, that cheatgrass may have been introduced in packing material. So I'm not sure that we really know about first introduction causes. I do think that vehicles, wildlife, recreationalists, wind, any number of these things are likely spreading. And we know that along those pathways where we see some frequent disturbance, where roads or different things are being maintained, that the likelihood of introduction and establishment may lead to introduction into some of those core areas.
Yeah, and I'd also say there's a lot of contamination in seed that is being planted still. So a lot of states don't have laws regarding, the amount, like having weed-free seed and forage. So Wyoming does have a lot of these laws and are trying to pass some more, I think, but a lot of states don't have those regulations.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, the Wyoming State Seed Law, Shannon, 1,200 seeds per pound of native seed is allowable for cheatgrass in certified seed in the state of Wyoming right now. So people kind of have to swallow that when they're doing a restoration project, that they might accidentally be planting cheatgrass seeds.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, that's okay. So I'm going to keep us moving. We have kind of two related questions. And actually, Shannon, while you were talking, I had the same question pop up. So a couple of the related questions, and I thought about it when you were showing your slides for Boulder County and the 5-year study. So the questions are, how long will a site remain invasive free after a treatment? And I had the same question for the Boulder County sites. Have they started to see any reinvasion yet? So two questions regarding how long sites will remain kind of free of an invasive species, and have you started to see any reinvasion to those treated sites?
Yeah, so the answer is going to be it depends. So if you're starting with a really core intact area and maybe a low invasion, your chance of removing that invasion with one shot is a lot higher than a site that has a higher invasion and maybe less perennials to respond. So some of the Boulder County sites, that's a good example to use. They first started treating in 2015 because they weren't grazed areas, they were natural areas. And some of those treatments from 2015 are still holding. So I'd say they've depleted the seed bank probably in those sites, but the response of the perennials was very good. They started with a good intact system. They've had other sites where they've had to make repeat applications, and we've seen that in northern Wyoming too, especially in Ventonata sites. We've seen like the third year, we go back in, make another treatment, because we start to see the reinvasion. But I would say it's not overnight. You don't wake up the next summer and go, wow, there's cheatgrass or Ventonata everywhere. It's usually going to be in a more disturbed area or an area that higher cover to begin with, an area that's maybe used by cattle more or something like that. And so you could start doing targeted treatments, or maybe only half the acres need to be treated. So it's very dependent on site and what you're starting with. So that's kind of, it's adaptive management. You do have to continue to follow your site once you treat and see when those hot spots pop up.
Hey,
So we
Shannon,
have
could I
two.
also, oh, I'm sorry. I'm gonna say, could I also add? I think one more key thing is thoroughness of coverage on those applications is absolutely critical. And we've learned a lot. Our working group, when we've gone from relatively small plots to tens of thousands of acres at a time, that it's got to be a well done application to get that long term control.
So we're going to do two rapid fire questions because we're almost out of time, and there's a quick wrap up here at the end of the webinar. So the first question, I'm going to give you both questions, and then maybe you guys can give me a rapid fire answers. The first question is, has there been any exploration with biochar as a means to destroy troubled seed banks or vegetation? And the second question is, do you see any benefits to increasing the amounts of moisture in certain areas via cloud seeding?
Wow, Shannon, you got those? I can take a run at the biochar thing. I'm not specifically familiar of any biochar research, but there was a big push in the late 90s, early 2000s, looking at using carbon sources to shift the carbon to nitrogen ratio on rangeland soils that led to short-term depletion of annual grass populations. So things like adding sugar or sawdust that changed the microbial community. They use it as a food source. It made more microbes grow. They tied up the nitrogen. There was less nitrogen available for the annual grasses. We saw a short-term decline in annual grasses. My assumption is that something like biochar may work the same way. But I think the practicality of doing that across hundreds of thousands of acres of Western rangelands, we couldn't meet the practicality standard at that point in time. Cloud seeding, maybe that one goes with Shannon.
Yeah, I was gonna say I've heard of it, them doing that in crop, but I've never heard of cloud seeding for rangeland applications. So unless I'm just not aware of something, I don't think that's anything that's been looked at. And I'm not sure about the feasibility of doing anything for annual grasses with cloud seeding. That would be my quick answer to that.
Yeah,
Okay.
It's a great question. Great question.
Yep.
All right, so I think we at least made it through all the questions that were in the Q&A. So I'm going to hand it back over to Allison to sign us off, and Shannon and Brian